I don't think there's a single group out there that has aggregated more personality and attitude in the world's collective consciousness than the Celts. From the wild and free Irish, the rugged and rambunctious Scots, or to the well, everyone knows what the Welsh do. The world may make jokes and stereotypes at their expense time and time again, and they may have a less than stellar relation with certain historical powers, but the Celts truly have impacted all of humanity through mass migration to every corner of the globe in the past few centuries, and it's easy to forget that at one point Celtic groups dominated the vast majority of the European continent and even beyond. Celtic groups formerly inhabited all of West, Central, and parts of Eastern Europe, with some Celts, such as the Galatians, even making it as far as Anatolia in the middle of modern-day Turkey. But over the generations, Celtic groups gradually lost territory to the surrounding Slavic, Germanic, and Italic groups through the rise of various empires and migration of different tribes, and the last of the continental Celtic languages went extinct over 1,000 years ago. I'll save this for another day, but there are various groups in West Central Europe today that claim to be the last remnants of these old Celtic civilizations, and some languages, such as Galician in Spain, and Friulian and other Raetic tongues in Italy have moderate to major Celtic vocabulary. But of course, even following centuries of Roman rule, Germanic invasions, and Viking raids, the Celts of the British Isles, or British and Irish Isles as they are called in Ireland, remain the last Celtic group to survive. I was actually mistaken in a previous video when I said that the Vikings were the first to stumble upon Iceland, as it was actually the Celts who had settled in both Iceland and the Faroe Islands well before the Norse came upon them. And the Vikings frequently raided Celtic lands for war brides and concubines, so much so that the maternal DNA of the modern Icelandic and Faroese is majority Celtic today, while over a third of the overall genes originate from the British Isles. The English, or Anglo-Saxons, are the result of the conquest of the native Brittonic peoples by incoming Germanic tribes such as the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons, who gradually fused into one over many, many generations, and the roots of the English language lie in the eastern North Sea region, with Frisian being its closest living relative, although it's been heavily influenced by Latin languages since the Norman invasion in the 11th century AD. So, in a way, the English and Western Norse peoples can be thought of as Celtic hybrid populations, which is why in the Anglosphere, sometimes the dominant group is referred to not as Anglos, but as Anglo-Celts. In addition to the large Celtic diaspora and the fact that the English are actually a mixed population of mainland Germanic and insular Celtic DNA, with the majority of their maternal haplogroups actually being Celtic in origin, it fares to reason that the bulk of the gene pool of all Anglosphere nations originates among the native peoples of the British Isles. So I suppose you could include all of them in the so-called Celtic world, but for this video specifically, we're going by self-identified ancestry only. Over the centuries, different Celtic groups such as the Gaels, Picts, and Britons evolved into the modern Celtic nations we see today, and this is heavily complicated by the modern political situation, which we'll get to later, and these include the three most well-known, the Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, as well as some lesser-known groups such as the Ulster Scots, Bretons, Manx, and Cornish, with it being debated whether the latter two ethnic groups even still exist anymore. The native Britons lived on the western half of Great Britain and were forced further and further west following the Anglo-Saxon invasion, with the Bretons actually being the result of Celts from modern-day Cornwall fleeing to the Breton Peninsula in France and establishing a nation there, while those who remained became the Cornish, Welsh, and Cumbrians, the latter of which has been extinct since the 12th century. Scots are really more a combination of the Picts, Gaels, and Britons, rather than descending from a single group, as although the Pictish language native to Scotland went extinct in the 11th century, Gaels from Ireland migrated to the area, giving rise to Scottish Gaelic, and this identity has evolved into simply Celtic. And conversely, Scottish migrants from the lowlands migrated to Northern Ireland, giving rise to the Ulster Scots, or Scots-Irish. Therefore, nearly all of the Celtic peoples are interconnected in some way or another, and after centuries of informal and formal rule by the English and French, the Celtic identity has evolved into something quite unique, as despite most ethnic Celts losing their original languages long ago, they still heavily identify with the Celtic culture despite being partially assimilated into their respective countries. The Celts are also famous for having one of the largest ethnic diasporas of any nations in the world, and this is due to a variety of factors, most notably the Irish famine of the 1840s, wherein millions fled to the New World, where they certainly faced harsh adversities and created a solidarity in these new lands. And today it's estimated that the ethnic Irish population is many times more, around the magnitude of 6 to 8 times as many in the overseas diaspora when compared to those who remained in the British Isles. Over time, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh who went to areas of the British Empire, including South Africa, Zimbabwe, India, and the British West Indies, became heavily integrated with the English, and in many ways there are no longer any ethnic or cultural distinctions between them in the Anglosphere. Although you don't really hear much about them, Bretons do have a moderate overseas diaspora, settled mostly in French colonies such as Quebec, Louisiana, St. Pierre, and Miquelon, where the small island population is predominantly a mix of French, Breton, and Basque origin, and elsewhere in the world you might not have expected, such as Africa, India, or Southeast Asia, and numbers are rather hard to come by as France has a history of banning ethnic, religious, or linguistic censuses, but if I had to hazard a guess, I'd estimate that 1.5 to 2.5 million ethnic Bretons are among the global diaspora, based on the fact that there are around 20 to 30 million ethnic French in the global diaspora. The Celts are certainly a group of nations currently undergoing a cultural transition, which has predictably resulted in a bit of an identity crisis throughout the Celtic world, similar to what has occurred to the Basques, Kurds, Hmong, and other large stateless ethnic minorities, although technically the Irish are no longer stateless since the independence of the Republic of Ireland in the 20th century. However, it doesn't really matter since centuries of incorporation with the British has already made its impact, and today less than 5% of the Celtic realm actively speaks one of the Celtic languages, principally Irish, Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, or Breton as a first language, and only another 8% has second language knowledge of one of the Celtic languages, although it is worth noting that there has been a strong cultural and linguistic revival among the Welsh and Breton especially, who have become reinvigorated in their old ethnic heritage. Despite the large ethnic diaspora, there are very few Celtic language speakers in other parts of the world, with a handful in the US and Canada, but the largest number are actually in the Welsh settlements of Yawladfa in Patagonia in southern Argentina. You also have the Scots dialect, or language as some call it, which is not Celtic in origin but has been heavily influenced by Scottish Gaelic, and before I really learned about it, I used to think that it was just English spoken with a Scottish accent, but after listening to examples, I can tell you that's not exactly true. Overall, in the Celtic homeland, a majority, around 2/3, would speak a dialect of English, while around 1/4 speak the French language, so it would appear that the languages of their host nations have gradually become dominant in the Celtic realm, with Welsh and Breton being the most commonly native-spoken Celtic languages, and although there are virtually no more native speakers of Manx or Cornish, the linguistic revival has seen thousands of youth learning these languages once more, effectively bringing them back from the dead, although the nations themselves never truly died. Due to these great challenges faced by many of the Celtic peoples, such as war, famine, disease, and forced assimilation, many have proposed a union of sorts between the Celtic peoples. So what would it look like if we had a Celtic union, or even a united Celtic country in Europe? By looking at a map of the Celtic nations today, it would be a rather awkward arrangement to say the least, being mostly confined to islands and peninsulas on the fringes of Europe, but I suppose it does have a certain charm to it, with a population of nearly 22 million and an area around 83,000 square miles, or 215,000 square kilometers. That's about the same size and population as Romania. Now, ironically, due to a variety of factors, including the relocation of several prominent international corporations, the Republic of Ireland has one of the highest GDPs per capita of any country in Europe or the world, easily beating out the United States, England, or any other country in the Anglosphere. So it would appear that centuries of being trampled by historic powers and natural disasters has actually turned out quite alright for these crafty Irish. However, other areas such as Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales are still a bit behind when compared to the Republic of Ireland, and all this adds up to a GDP of nearly $1 trillion US, around 45,000 per capita, making them able to easily compete with the big dogs of Europe such as Germany, France, Italy, or Spain. Looking at the demographics of the Celtic world, it would appear fairly homogeneous, with nearly 95% being of European heritage and 85% identifying as ethnically Celtic, but the division of different Celtic ethnicities, who all have very different cultures, shows the true diversity of this realm, with the largest identities being Irish, Scottish, Breton, and Welsh, with smaller non-Celtic minorities of English, French, and other Europeans, predominantly Poles and Lithuanians, and the largest racial minorities would be South Asians, Middle Easterners, and Africans. The Celtic world is also incredibly religiously diverse as well, with no one single group making up a majority, although Catholicism would be the largest religion, followed by Protestantism, with there being a very large irreligious population of over a third, being much higher in Wales, Scotland, and Brittany when compared to Ireland, which is one of the more religious nations in Western Europe. Smaller minorities would include Muslims, Hindus, Orthodox Christians, and neo-pagans such as Druids or Wiccans, a group I actually did an entire video about, as although small, are currently growing quite quickly in many countries. Now, I don't mean to disappoint those Celtic enthusiasts out there, but I don't believe it to be likely that the Celtic nations will unite as a single country anytime soon, or ever, but something I do see possibly becoming a reality is some sort of loose political union between the Celtic world, even though Ireland is the only independent country of the bunch. If Scotland were to become independent, which very nearly happened only a few years ago, and if Northern Ireland united with the Republic of Ireland, they could propose some sort of political or economic union to try and compete against the other Western European juggernauts. So although unrealistic, let me know your thoughts on the Celtic world and what it would look like if these nations united as a single country. What do you think the capital, currency, and official language would be? How do you think interregional migration would affect the new nation and national ethnic identity? And for today's poll, let me know which of these nations in the Celtic world you'd like to learn more about. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.